Who are you?
I write about internet speech governance for the Cato Institute. Even if you aren't interested in politics, politics may be interested in you.
How do you personally define freedom?
My goal was to eventually go to law school and work for an organization called the Institute for Justice, which sues the federal government. I did surgery on a snake the other week off of YouTube.
How do you think we need to think about free speech on the internet with these different platforms? Welcome to today's episode of Getting to Know You. I'm your host, Cameron Edward Benton, and on today's episode, I have the great pleasure of introducing you to Will Duffield. Will is an adjunct scholar for the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank, where he often writes about the interesting intersection of free speech and the internet. Will and I have a really cool conversation diving into libertarian ideals, his personal philosophies, as well as his interesting connection to U.S. history, and why he was thrown into prison for selling lemonade. Will is just an absolutely delight of a human being. I learned a ton from him on this conversation and our talks in Puerto Rico, particularly in this episode about the importance of a concept called exit, which we'll get into in the episode. So without further ado, here is Getting to Know Will Duffield. Who are you?
Hey Cameron, I'm Will Duffield, and I write about internet speech governance for the Cato Institute, but I do lots of other things too.
Wonderful. Well, Will Duffield, what is the Cato Institute? Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
We're a public policy think tank, and we're libertarians. We're kind of the old school libertarian group in DC, so we've been there since the late 70s, sort of the first from what's sometimes seen as a fringe political movement, but really a long-standing one, to put on a jacket and tie, go to Washington, and try to really engage with the policy process to make America a freer place. I joined in 2017. I've been there in one capacity or another since, and actually had interned there a summer or two before that. But it's really been my window into Washington and Washington life over the past, coming up on a decade pretty soon.
Wow, that's awesome. And I guess for the sake of the audience, although I also want to hear your own specific definition of it, like what is a libertarian, and what does that mean that you believe about the world, or the Cato Institute believes about the world, etc.?
Yeah, a libertarian is someone who values freedom, and usually political conceptions of freedom, above most other values. I view human liberty as integral to human flourishing and worthy of the highest respect in politics. We don't view politics as the means to a good life, though, and I think that's one of the most difficult aspects of working in politics as a libertarian. I'm here in Washington because I'd like more people to be able to think less about the place, but in doing so, I have to think about what's going on in Washington a lot, and that can be grating. I think perhaps can produce a little more burnout there, or for folks of my political philosophic bent, than for those who really think that they're creating the best possible world by engaging in politics, that's the route to the good, in a way that, I don't know, most of the time I think I'd really rather be sailing or playing with my dog, but growing up, I more and more had to recognize that it was important to pay attention to these things, to what was going on around the world and in Washington, and that, even if you aren't interested in politics, politics may be interested in you.
Yeah, I think I would love to hear you say more about that, because I think, to your point, one of the things that's interesting about libertarianism, as I understand it, right, is it's basically wanting as little government intervention as possible, right? And so to your point, like there's probably a value set or a mindset for years. It's like, oh, I do want to just go sail around the world. I want to go and approach all these different things. And yet, to your point, like there is a sense of like, well, this thing is like encroaching upon me or the things that I want to do or want to protect the other people in my life around. So how do you wrestle with that like back and forth between, I guess, that desire to engage and do something or prevent certain things from happening at the very least, and then, rather than just go live your life and do your own libertarian thing without anybody watching you, in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I'm engaging in politics in a purely defensive capacity. It's not as though I was out there on my farm and in a cinematic Hollywood moment, the government came, interfered, and made that life impossible until I set an apple on my desk in Washington, Mr. Smith style. However, I grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania, a stone's throw from Valley Forge, and there I was really steeped in American founding era revolutionary history, mythos, early Enlightenment philosophy, reading John Dickinson's Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, and encountering so much of that stuff at quite a young age, I think gave me a very strong and sometimes incorrect or contemporarily ill-fitting understanding of what America is and should be. And so I really came to politics and became concerned with the political direction and future of our country, growing up with this history in the wake of 9/11, watching the Patriot Act passed, reading about Bostonians back in the day rejecting the search and seizure of their effects, lobsterback British soldiers breaking into their trunks, knocking them open with rifle butts and looking at their stuff, and then finding that we'd given permission to the NSA to rifle through all of our digital trunks, and that the wars we were fighting abroad, particularly Iraq, just none of it seemed to fit America's founding purpose or ideals. And so that led to a whole nother history deep dive to figure out how we'd ended up here, how we went from being a kind of agrarian liberal republic to global hegemon, with a very different set of interests and different set of domestic policies as a result. And that, both curiosity and really horror at times, seeing how we had evolved as a state, led me to politics. I hadn't really thought of it as a career, though, at that point, or in my teens. I began to value civic participation. I would go to anti-war protests, rallies. I went to the Rally to Restore Sanity. That old John Stewart. It just feels like such a different age.
Yeah.
That and was really involved in Project Chanology, the fight between 4chan, an internet message board, and the Church of Scientology, which had been sparked by the church's removal of a video from YouTube on copyright grounds showing Tom Cruise behaving a little nuts, going a bit wacky. And back then, when the internet was much more of a small hobbyist medium, people cared a lot more about access to information, the idea that information wants to be free. This sort of cypherpunk ethos was very strong and in vogue culturally online, such that now what would be seen as a routine act of moderation, another DMCA takedown, really sparked controversy, revolt, and an ongoing spat between 4chan and the COS, culminating in street protests in front of COS facilities,
Wow.
doxing, lawfare, and all of that was, for the most part, ignored by contemporary media or at the time. Um, but so much of what I saw then in that kerfluffle fight um, has become normal politics since. The idea of doxing, the journalistic ethics concerns around when you reveal someone's online identity when you shouldn't, that's a CNN issue now in a way that it was a sideshow in 2008. But that sort of civic participation ultimately culminated in my selling lemonade in front of the Capitol building in an act of protest intended to draw attention to the plight of children selling lemonade who'd had their stands shut down for violating local zoning codes, not having been inspected by the health authorities, that sort of thing. In the summer of 2011, there were a couple newsworthy covered incidents involving kids around the country that prompted myself and a couple others to hold a lemonade stand in front of the Capitol. Well, we thought that this would be, maybe we'd get told off something. We didn't think it would lead to an arrest, and it did. We felt that it was a speech act because we were making a loss on each cup of lemonade sold. Hot August day, but when we were initially told to stop, we persisted in selling lemonade, kind of active civil disobedience, but also feeling as though we were, in a sense, just speaking, even though we were handing out Dixie cups and receiving a dime. The Capitol Police disagreed. We were arrested, put in a van, kind of interrogated. They had someone called a DC domestic incident investigator, which seemed like a silly post 9/11 position that probably shouldn't be called in for lemonade salespeople, but nevertheless was speaking to us about our sources of funding, where we organized. We were a Facebook group. We'd all put in a little bit of money. But because we were arrested on Capitol grounds, kind of like those J6 people, although different in some very important ways, we were charged federally. So I had to come down to D.C. to stand trial in the United States of America v. Will Duffield throughout my freshman year of undergrad. And they tried a bunch of dirty tricks, really, to bully us into taking a plea deal. We were there as activists, and so we didn't take the deal. We wanted our day in court. We wanted, hopefully, a jury to acquit us after finding this whole thing ridiculous. But at one point, we were ordered to take drug tests as part of our continuing pretrial release. And so the experience certainly hardened my political stance, just kind of seeing the extent to which the state would go, how much of other people's money it would spend to try to punish us for selling lemonade. But throughout this process, meeting various attorneys, talking to the media, I realized that there was a lot more I could do with the right degrees, with a position at a think tank, perhaps. Although in those days I was much more thinking of becoming an attorney myself. That by doing that I could get a lot more done, have much more impact than I could just getting arrested for things. There are some professional activists who just get arrested over and over. Just, the Code Pink folks in the anti-war movement, but unfortunately, now they seem to be kind of Russian shills taking their anti-war pacifist stand a little too far. Maybe just following the money, but I thought that there was something I could do differently, and probably at the time as well, I'd started going to school to undergrad for theatrical prop construction, lighting, costume design. I'd done a lot of that in high school. And looking at the lifestyle on the road of lighting designers and the fact that it seemed like all of my professors in the field were divorced, kind of put me off to that as real career for myself. I'd like to get back into community theater at some point. I enjoyed building cosplay props, that kind of thing now and then, but
Yeah.
I saw a different professional path for myself. After.
What kind of cosplay do you do?
Oh, jeez. So I will often go these days as nighttime Escanor from Seven Deadly Sins because when I put on a pair of spectacles, I look exactly like him. It's just a little uncanny. In the past, as a teenager, I bleached my hair blonde and for a Vash the Stampede outfit from Trigun. I can still barely squeeze into that red coat, but it's harder than it used to be. What about yourself? Do you cosplay ever, Ken?
No, I don't. I think it's one of my favorite things about you as a person is that I think when I first met you, right, we were in Puerto Rico, and you struck me as this almost like a time capsule to a certain degree. Like there's a sense of like, I'm going to go and explore the world, and like I have my interests, both philosophical and worldly, that are fascinating, and you're intellectual and deep. But then there's also this part that, like, looking at you, I wouldn't think, oh, this guy definitely does cosplay. And, like, specifically with, like, an anime character, for example, right? Or these types of things. Like, it's not something that I would initially see you and think of. And so I think it's, like, a wonderful, just, like, character trait of yourself, of being so, multifaceted and I think surprising in a lot of ways. It's really beautiful.
Thank you very much for that. I would note, I guess, on that point that the Victorians loved their internet. They were really excited when the telegraph came along and totally took to it and came up with their own little memes, codes. You had a whole subculture of telegraph operators who would communicate in the downtime on the line, just in Morse code, chatting. Led to all kinds of marriages because women could get a job as a telegraph operator and be communicating with some young man in another town on the other side of England, just chatting away in your off time, and those, lead to tender moments and care and all that.
How much of that is like mirrors in a lot of ways, like especially like I would say like the early, like maybe not early, but like late 90s, early 2000s, like a lot of the chat, like AOL Instant Messenger, and then leading to these messages where you've never actually like met or seen somebody. But do they have a lot of the same, both like positives and negatives and challenges with like catfishing or even that kind of stuff as well?
I think so. Even something like fake news. Now, allegedly, you could pretty well tell whether you were communicating with the telegraph operator you thought you were, because even though you're sending a standard series of dots and dashes, everyone has their own cadence and rhythm, and tends to pause or hold just a little bit longer than someone else. And if this is the medium that you're speaking in the same way as you'd probably notice if a friend had taken over someone else's computer in that old Usenet or AIM chat room. Apparently telegraph operators had a style. But you certainly saw early sort of check-kiting style crimes where someone would attempt to wire money to be available at a certain place and then take it out after the message was sent on the back end, but before it was then received by a compatriot on the other, so as to take the money twice. One of the most striking things about it is that it can also go backwards. It's a reminder that technological progress is not absolute. We had a telegraph cable to the UK, to Europe, from America before the Civil War. During the Civil War, it broke, and because the war was sucking up all of the important resources, the Atlantic wasn't terribly safe at that time with privateers and interceptions and all that. It wasn't relayed until, I think, 1867. And so you had this instantaneous communication. People could get wool prices from England to the New York Stock Exchange immediately, efficient markets, and then they went backwards and became less efficient. You had to wait for the boat for almost a whole decade until you laid a new cable and got the Victorian internet back again. So I'm always, I think, looking at and trying to make sense of our own cultural adaptations. Make sense of my own relationship to new technology, looking back to how people in the past, and particularly people with a cultural outlook fairly similar to our own, have approached these sorts of things, and how their reception has ebbed and flowed. I'm a big nuclear power booster, but I recognize how we got scared after dropping the bomb, pointing a bunch of weapons at the Soviets and they at us, and after something like 3 Mile Island, and really, scared ourselves out of using what I consider to be just the most amazing technology that's come along, to the point that we're all still driving combustion cars and breathing fumes from burning oil and all that. 70 odd years after we figured out a better way.
Yeah. No, I think that's fascinating. I was even thinking about that when you were talking about your stance as a libertarian. It would also the evolution of a lot of technology, or even pioneering new areas, right? It's there is almost a typical pattern around the Old West, for example, right? It's here's this new land, we're free, we can do whatever we want, and then as the population grows, as more and more people become involved, there's a natural need or desire for okay, well, how do we create order out of this chaos? I just came from Burning Man, and it has a very similar history as well, where the original founders were very anarchists, and you could be out going around, and part of what they would do is drive and shoot at things, ideally not where there are people involved. But when it got to a certain point, it was well, we can't keep doing that when there's thousands and thousands of people. The amount of risk is too high, and so there's this kind of natural clamping down, or a natural governance that kind of forms, and then people want to leave. They're oh, this isn't what I want anymore. So I'm curious, with your own stance as a libertarian, kind of seeing how America has evolved, but even the internet and technology going on a similar pattern. How do you find yourself in that narrative with how things are? What's the role that you believe that you're needing to play at this point?
So first, I think the transition between those states is always fascinating. How a group of people decides they've hit a threshold requiring some different form of governance. And how you update everyone's norms when people were used to driving around and shooting at things before, and now there are 1,000 people and you can't do that. But it's difficult to get that message around. People feel as though they have some stake in the previous way of doing things, and that this is an intrusion upon them. We've really seen it online as the internet has moved from being a hobbyist medium to something mass, something for everyone, the normies included. And I think a lot of culture war upheaval that we've seen online in the past decade, while ostensibly about other things, really comes down to almost a question of migration or community membership. Something like Gamergate is about who is a gamer, what is a gamer. And as that definition changes, there are people who either resent the new meaning, or resent those that they find having been gamers that they now consider themselves a part of. I think that usually the best way of navigating these transitions is through bottom-up governance, looking for emergent solutions that have evolved rather than being imposed, and then attempting to codify them, to formalize them, and perhaps bring everyone under their ambit. But as much as possible, discovering what works first in a more free-form space by allowing people to try different methods of dispute resolution, for instance. In the past, I've written a fair amount on the law merchant. This was a private system of law, sort of like civil law for handling disputes between merchants of different European kingdoms at that point, later states, but because they didn't or couldn't necessarily agree to use the law of any one country, you're always dealing with controversies in which one party would be advantaged by using their home law or one set of law over another. They gravitated towards a certain set of dispute resolution mechanism norms, which then in common law cases, one by one, were incorporated into the English legal system. So judges would say, well, the way merchants have dealt with this for a while is X, and that seems like a reasonable way of doing it. For instance, whether the Royal Mail is liable for a lost check. Someone's stolen a check out of the mail. And a judge says, well, they aren't, because for a while merchants have developed this practice of cutting their checks in half and sending them in different envelopes so as to prevent this. And because they have, in an emergent sense, come up with this solution, we think it would be unreasonable to now place all of the responsibility on the Royal Mail, imposing costs on them and perhaps on everyone else if we have to now certify mail or store it more securely. Instead, this emergent solution works pretty well, so I'm going to say that that's the law of the land in this case. That controls their liability. So as much as possible, I think that that's the best way to handle those sorts of state changes. Online, I think platforms like Reddit, where we can decentralize moderation to the subreddit level, where those who have a lot of skin in the game in a local community are the ones making the decisions, tends to work better than trying to do everything from Meta HQ out in San Francisco.
What are some of the common? I'd say what are the? I don't know, not common rebuttals per se, but what are the valid criticisms of that? Where is the opposite true if you find it to be at all? Are there places where a top-down situation can be more effective or valuable? Where I'm thinking of a situation where in a grassroots area, let's say due to racism or due to something else involved, the people who maybe need the support or want to have a voice are repressed. I even think about it within certain subreddits that can be an issue, right? Where there's the moderation team has gotten so out of whack that people aren't able to actually get the voice that they want to have.
Also, this is why exit is so important. The big difference between the kind of perhaps small southern town that you're thinking of and the misgoverned subreddit is that it's very, very cheap to go and start your own subreddit, and even to go start a Reddit clone if Reddit decides that they don't want your subreddit. There's now Ovarit, the kind of trans-critical radfem Reddit clone, when their subreddit was shut down, and the Donald.win, which used to be R the Donald, but after January 6th was booted from Reddit. And so online, because switching costs, the cost of creating your own website, is very low because real estate is infinite and therefore inexpensive. I think we can accept worse governance in many cases, or allow those who want to toil and remain to do so, knowing that exit is a click away, so you can't hate it too much being here. People log on to Twitter and talk about this hell site, and they're on Twitter talking about it. Yep. They could be on Nostr or Blue Sky or something, but they've chosen those trade-offs. In the real world, excuse me while I pound in here. I think it all turns on how much we trust that top-down authority to continue to behave well into the future, and that's always been a checkered relationship between the federal government and states in the United States, as far as who's in any given scenario sort of on the side of right and justice. But generally, I think having 50 different laboratories rather than attempting to handle everything from the center, from Washington, works out much better than the alternative. If you look at the kind of culture war questions that are bad enough at the moment that we tie ourselves in knots around in Washington at the federal level enough at the moment, if you were coming up with a single federal rule for women's sports in high school, that would just be dialed up to 11. It would be so much nastier if no one had an out or a way of picking a separate piece, even if we might look at it and say, that's not just, that's not the best way to do things.
Yeah.
I think top-down solutions, top-down governance tends to work best when everyone is on the same page about the goals. If you're embarking on the Manhattan Project, if you're all there to build this thing, then that kind of viceroyism or delineation of responsibility is a lot more acceptable to everyone involved, because they can see how it's all leading to their goal. If they have different goals, however, they don't agree about where their energy should be directed, well, then that top-down governance just feels tyrannical. It's someone making you do something that you think is bad or at least unproductive.
Yeah, it's one of the weird things about, I feel like, human nature, but it's something that I got from this book called Power versus Force by, I can't think of his name right now, but I'll think of it later. But in the book, he talks about the difference between those two things and how power essentially is influence, right? Your ability to actually influence and inspire change in other people, rather than force, which is used to control other people. And you can force something that is good for them, but because it's through force, like how it's being communicated or how it's happening, ends up creating a downstream effect of things, partly maybe psychological because we just don't like it. We don't like it when somebody forces us to do something.
Undignified. It does harm to our dignity to be made to do things against our will. I think that dignitary harm is very real and has a psychological effect, definitely.
Yeah. How do we, from your perspective, how do we, I guess, allow for more of that when the world is becoming so much bigger, more united, more grandiose and complex? Like there's so much happening all the time, and our lives are all much more intertangled, whether it's through the internet or through just the globalization of the world. Like, how do we do this dance between larger government and wanting ideals across the world, and then also needing that variation and needing that ability to experiment more locally and have that creativity? Because I can see the benefits and costs in a lot of different ways towards both. And I think the more that I've sat with it, I almost think that it's less about one being necessarily predominant with a lot of these kind of polarizing conversations, and more about how do we navigate that dance in a healthier way? How do we navigate the polarization of these things, and that there can be benefit in both. But I'm curious, how? Yeah, what is your approach to all that? I said a lot, so.
I have to return a little bit to exit as a concept. And I think the internet has been very valuable here in the extent to which it's fostered non-geographic communities of interest. You don't have to live around the same people, the people who share your interests, in order to engage with them, exchange ideas, progress on a hobby, etc. And in some ways, that relaxes tensions around local governance. If I don't need to, not get everyone to have a parade about the thing that I like, but can instead talk about it, go to a meetup somewhere else with people on the internet who I've come across, then not needing that same level of local buy-in allows me to do my own thing while letting others do theirs. In general, I think globalization is certainly compatible with freedom. We've seen, in a kind of Fukuyamaist sense, a general trend all around the world towards more liberal markets, more rights for women to engage in the commercial and home spheres.
Just to pause real quick.
Agency.
When you say liberal markets, I think that you're using like the big L liberal, not like the left-wing liberal per se. Is that accurate? Because some people might not know the difference. If you want to clarify that.
Yes, liberalism as allowance, as license, as permission, freer, more interconnected markets. More goods can be exchanged between a wider set of people, often with fewer tariff restrictions than in the past. And I think that's a good thing, even when it ends up eroding a certain amount of local variation. It's there's always a tension between having difference and allowing people to ultimately, in these different places, make their own free choices, which seem to look like moving towards a more Western middle class style of living. I don't want to glamorize folks living in grass skirts without access to modern medicine. It might be really interesting as a tourist to be able to go to those places, and you'll hear regrets that, I wish I could have seen this before it was developed. But for the people living there, that development means your kids aren't dying of malaria, and that matters a whole lot. So I don't want to sort of, fetishize difference that way, or especially when it's born of people's inability to move or choose to move beyond the circumstances they've been born into.
Are there things from your perspective that we can do to help increase exit, for lack of a better word? And I think you and I have used that term, but when you're talking about exit, you mean the ability to leave a particular community or space.
Yeah, political community, geographic community, and form your own. Gosh, I mean, I think there are lots of ways. We could allow a whole lot more local difference. We could allow more difference between states in the United States. We just have on abortion. And broadly, I think that's a good thing. Around drug laws, that sort of thing. But even within states as well. And I think there are certainly tensions that I see now around, say highways, roads, these large trucks that people have, pedestrian concerns. The hoods are just getting higher and higher, and if you get hit by something like that, you will die. But at the moment, we say that if a car is street legal, it's street legal everywhere. And perhaps that should be reconsidered. Maybe there should be different standards for the kind of car you can have in New York City, and the kind of car you can have in upstate New York. And while it might be a pain in the ass if you have the big truck and you want to take it into the city, ultimately you can be allowed to have a larger truck out in the country, and the city people can get around much more quickly and feel more comfortable moving through their community if we allow two different sets of rules there. Right now, having one set of rules for all leaves, I think, a lot more people unhappy in the situation they find themselves in. So I think we can allow more variation, gradation in a lot of ways. I can't take my dog into restaurants. Is that the restaurateur's choice? No, it's a health code. And yet, when I travel around the world, when I go to the UK, he can go into a pub. And it's not like people in the UK are dying of dog-borne diseases all the time. So I travel for me, I think, has done a lot to kind of buttress my belief in human freedom, because there are all sorts of things that I wasn't allowed to do at home, or saw people restricted in how they were doing it, even in these free United States. And then you go somewhere else and you find out that everyone can get by just fine without that rule or restriction. You can go bring your dog to a pub and everyone will be okay. So I think the more I travel, the more of those sorts of things I discover, and it's always inspiring.
How do you personally define freedom?
So it's not just being able to do whatever I please, come and go. I think the understanding that I'm not dominated by anyone, that there isn't some power that can arbitrarily interfere with my life at will, that my expectations as to what I can do, how I can and can't be interfered with, policed, or governed, are stable, predictable, and trustworthy. And within that set of expectations, I am then free. I know how I ought to behave, how my neighbor is likely to behave, within a basic framework that then frees me. So I really see freedom as non-domination, and the secure knowledge that you aren't or won't be. I've done some work on jury nullification in this sense, and I think it helps to sort of illustrate what I mean, in that when you are guaranteed a trial by jury, you know that the state isn't the judge of its own case. It can't decide that the law means XYZ, that 2 + 2 = 5, and therefore you are guilty. You can trust that your community is going to ultimately be the judge of the law. And that makes it something that you and your community own and can rely upon in a way that, if it's a foreign imposition, if you can't ultimately be the judge of it, it won't and can't be. So,
yeah, I'm not sure. I know you checked out some of my episodes before. Have you watched the one with Hope Casella at all? The Los Angeles County Public Defender.
I'm afraid I didn't.
No?
Although I did see the thumbnail, and I had cause to think of it last night while watching. Probably staying up a little too late watching the rare bit of real libertarian policy propaganda in mainstream cinema. And I'm talking about Netflix's new film, Rebel Ridge, about a young man traveling to bail his cousin out of jail with enough cash to do so, being stopped and having it stolen from him by the police through a legal process called civil asset forfeiture, which is a huge bugbear of contemporary libertarians politically. Essentially, the state makes a case not against you, but against your property, arguing that it has been or is likely to have been used in a crime. And when they do this, they can seize the property up front without charging you, and then you need to sue them or contest their suit to retain control of usually your cash. Sometimes it's cars, sometimes it's homes, but it's a really nasty power that needs to be reined in. And it was delightful to see a popular Rambo-esque treatment of this, in which the local public defender gives a pitch-perfect explanation of how this process works, and you see how horribly unjust it is.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking about it because there's a lot of things that I would love to see a conversation between the two of you at some point. So maybe it's something we can do in the future, where it's like we can even do a podcast with the two of you on and talk about some of these different conversations, because I think you'll. I think you're just two of the smartest, well thought out and compassionate people that I've ever met around these topics, and I think you're brilliant. You guys would have an amazing conversation. So I hope you check out that episode at some point, because I think it's right up your alley.
I will do so. I am really struck by the ability of digital spaces to evoke memory. It's something, as I get older, it just awes me more and more. Stepping back into the World of Warcraft, wandering through a bit of Olin Forest, and recalling word for word an argument that I'd had with a girlfriend in high school on the phone while traipsing through that bit of digital forest a decade and a half ago.
Yeah.
And we can imagine a park bench in the real world evoking memory in a similar way, but it's only as I get older and have these fixed digital spaces that have been around for now more than half my life, that I can recognize that they can have the same effect.
Yeah, that's something I think about often with video games in particular, is like our generation was really raised with them in this very intimate way. And we have a similar kind of relationship with the internet where, I have 12 years of my life that there was no internet, or at least not one that was like practical or experienced, right? But then all of a sudden there was. And so it's more or less been a part of my life, but we've also grown with it in a way that, say, Gen Z hasn't, right? It's like you talk to somebody and you're like, oh, a Gen Z person, I was born before Google, and they look at you like that's incredible. But, it's, for us, it's been this thing that's like developed as we've aged and grown. And I'm curious about, for your own experience, like how has that, you think, shaped how you think about technology and interact with technology?
I think, frankly, I'm too quick to take digital literacy for granted, especially in younger generations, and that as millennials, it behooves us to recognize that we're kind of unique in that to come online as children, we had to join the hobbyist internet. You had to figure out how things worked, tinker with TCP/IP connections. I don't know, I dug my own fiber trench at one point. At the very least, you needed to understand a file tree. Anybody our age can do that. But if you're younger, your experience of the internet may just be an internet of phone apps. And that is a very different, perhaps much less agentic user experience. So when I think about digital literacy, about the ability to spot fake news, for instance, think critically about where we're sourcing our information, how we're shaping our friends' information space in what we're sharing. I think both, for boomers and all, it's kind of easy to say, well, they fall for this stuff. We can't expect them to be very, very digitally literate. But I think for young people who are getting the majority of their news via TikTok, this is just as much of a worry these days. And that in building technology going forward, simplicity isn't always and shouldn't always be the kind of predominant penultimate value. Apple products are great. I don't want to knock that. The ease of use and how it can bring technology to people who otherwise would struggle to use it. But you don't want to create unagentic users. I have a lot of time for projects like Urbit, for instance, which are a little off-putting, a little hard to get into, but ultimately in requiring more of the user, end up freeing them. Because when you understand how, either to physically build your computer, how to diagnose it when it goes wrong, how to understand what's happening with it, how someone can use it against you, etc., you are freed in your use of it. You may use that machine, that tool, more freely, and you're more likely to be able to turn it to your ends than if you didn't have that knowledge.
Yeah. How do you deal with that dance though? Because I think even with your point with becoming part of a think tank is you get to kind of relieve the responsibility of other people of a particular perspective or a voice or that effort, because you're the one centralizing all this information, you're specializing it, right? In the same way with a computer or new technology, it's the more that I know about it, that's great, but then I also have less time to actually do things, or it becomes a new source of all of this extra stuff if I have to learn about how to be a mechanic for my car and a mechanic for my computer and a mechanic for the plumbing in my house and the newer technologies that come on board as well, right? How do we deal with that?
It places interesting stresses on the old Heinlein specialization is for insects quote. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Maybe we can throw it up as a graphic or something. It says that, and I'm not going to include all of them, but a man should be able to butcher a hog, plan a funeral, say grace, build a house, die gallantly, etc. Specialization is for insects. And I do think there's a lot of value in that, particularly in thinking about Republican or Democratic citizenship, and this is small r, small d, being the citizen of a republic. That a certain well-roundedness is required in order to engage in politics, for instance, in order to vote well. And we can get into voting and skepticism voting and all of that. Ultimately you're making choices for other people, and it always makes you very uncomfortable to pull that lever because, ultimately, who am I to select one of these two people to rule over you? But I think, particularly in politics, that specialization is and has been a double-edged sword. In one way, it's how we represent third parties in this country. We have a first-past-the-post system. Third parties don't tend to do very well. And yet, there are all sorts of ideological entrepreneurs constantly trying to bring their ideas to one of these majority parties. And the majority parties want to win, so they try to select for winning ideas that people bring them. And a lot of this NGO think tank ecosystem basically exists to do that and to represent interests that might not have a home front and center in either the Republican or Democratic parties with capital letters, but nevertheless have an important, long-standing place in American civic, political, or economic life. And this can be a union, this can be a commercial association, Chamber of Commerce, United Auto Workers, that sort of thing. But again, as even commercial advocacy, union advocacy becomes more specialized, requires ever more minute knowledge of labor law or international tax law, then the members of those organizations, the people who they're supposed to represent, ultimately have less say in what the organization does, because they can't understand everything that UAW or the Molly Maguire Institute is up to, and they're trusting them to act in their best interest. But I think you do see more delinkage there as NGOs have become more specialized and membership organizations rely less on the actual votes of their members to determine what their policy is going to be.
Yeah, I keep going. I feel like I've circled back to this idea generally over and over again, but it is like this weird challenge of what do we do as we become bigger and more complex? Because it's like with all these things, to your point, like I feel so often with even like the tax code in our country as a basic citizen, right? It's like the amount of like legal knowledge you almost really have to understand things. Or I think about the financial sector a lot for a lot of people, and how much of a gate there is kept behind a law or a wall of literacy, right? You have to understand things that you were not taught through public education. And even if you were, would have to have probably a high bar of knowledge and mathematical skills and all these different things to kind of understand basic things on how you can save money easily for retirement and understanding, compounding interest on a very basic level. But then there's infinitely more complex things and ways that people take advantage of those things, and not in a negative way, but just take advantage of them for their own personal profit. That exists because people have a specialized knowledge or information or ability to understand said information, or is handed down through their political stuff. That's like all of these different trappings and webbings or skill sets that we need to be able to make a life for ourselves becomes infinitely more complex and complicated. That for myself, I think a lot of times I just sort of end up feeling overwhelmed or burnt out by all of the things, unless it was something that was handed down to me at a young age, because there ends up being an infinite amount of pathways, an infinite amount of ways that we can fuck up, and an infinite amount of ways that we could potentially succeed if we understood the information at a very accurate level.
Nobody can be perfect. I think a lot of it depends upon the incentives in play. In the market, I'm quite comfortable throwing my money into the Vanguard Total Stock Market Fund or some other set of funds, and trusting that those fund managers are properly competitively incentivized in their competition, both to get the bonus, to keep me as a customer rather than me going to JP Morgan, that they aren't going to screw me over too badly. Whatever they're taking, their rake is probably pretty fair, because if it were really unfair, someone else would have noticed and I would have followed them to a competitor long ago. But I think it does militate in favor of decentralization at times, just in thinking about the incentives in play. The people who come to Washington to make policy, who are plucked out of their Midwest town, they were the brightest, they won the spelling bee, they all come here, they want to make good policy. They're usually, caring, right-thinking people. But if they all get together here in D.C., and they're all a standard deviation brighter, perhaps, than the people that they're making rules for, they're going to come up with a set of rules that's freaking incomprehensible to a lot of people. It's going to be really hard for people to follow. And so maybe that efficiency isn't desirable. Maybe they're losing important local knowledge and local values as they attempt to statistically delineate success from failure around government programs. There's an anthropologist who unfortunately recently passed away, James C. Scott, who wrote a book called Seeing Like a State, How Certain Schemes to Improve the Human Condition Have Failed. And he argues that in many top-down systems, we aren't just making decisions from the center or from the top, but in doing so, in being able to do so, we simplify everything. We say that everything should be measured in meters or kilograms, and some standardization is obviously valuable. It's good for people to be able to take things to market from one side of France to the other. But if you look at a forest and you say, well, what do we get out of this forest? What's valuable? Ships' masts, straight trees. Well, right now, it's very hard to even measure how many of these straight trees we have, where they are. What if we just planted them in rows instead? Way easier to measure, but you lose a lot of the other value of the forest in that. Everything people got from the undergrowth disappears. It becomes a worse habitat, more fire-prone, perhaps. And so in attempting to simplify things to make them governable from the top down, where it was tolerable for the local forester to just wander around and chalk trees or whatever, you couldn't do that from Berlin. And so you standardize things, but you lose valuable local knowledge, metis, in the process. And so I think just being more cognizant of that, recognizing that not every decision needs to be passed up the chain that way, can take you a long way, frankly. Along with perhaps a willingness to tolerate some local inefficiency and difference that we look down on, that we don't like. We can say this is backwards. I don't like it, but as long as people aren't really being kept there, and I don't take the Amish. I don't have anything against the Amish per se, but their lifestyle is not for me. And if children born into an Amish way of living in a modern liberal country like ours didn't have the option of leaving, I would look askance at that community in a way that I'm willing to tolerate, even to an extent, the kind of regular animal abuse that's going to occur in that sort of lifestyle. If you're more subsistence, if you aren't using modern tech, you aren't going to get the vet as quickly. It's just there are trade-offs there, and I don't morally necessarily agree with all of them. If I had chickens, I would probably treat them much more as pets than disposable commodities. But in order to live freely, I have to kind of allow them to live that way. And as long as people can choose to enter and leave that community with relative freedom, I think that's acceptable. And we can I might look at a BDSM community in a really similar way and say, psychologically, I don't really think this is healthy for all of you, but I don't think that I know enough about all of your lives, past traumas, how you've dealt with them, etc., to step in and say, no, I'm taking that whip and ball gag away from you. You can't debase yourself like that. This is awful. Not just because it would be very, very presumptuous, but also because I'd be licensing people to interfere with me in all sorts of ways. People who don't like that I shoot ducks, whatever. And so there is what Oxford academic named Teresa Bajan and others before her, going all the way back to what's his name? Drawing a strange blank. There's been a song about the man by a band I enjoy. Roger Williams. Rhode Island theologian, early sort of colonial history. But what is referred to as mere civility. And we think of civility today often as a very thick set of practices, being courteous, kind, something far beyond just tolerating someone. But this conception, this mere civility, is really simple tolerance. And there wasn't an expectation, I think, even today, tolerance begins to either take on a different connotation of actual support, or we look askance at tolerance, because to just tolerate is kind of to silently judge. It's to maybe have the power to interfere or complain, but refrain from doing so, but not to support. and that in a colonial America of many, many different Christian sects who had lots of different ideas about how to worship God, the best way to get along was to practice this sort of mere civility, which Williams understood as perhaps doffing your hat to others, and therefore he maintained this, real aversion, hatred for Quakers who wouldn't do this. Felt as though their religious practice and not showing favor and kind of participating in this ritual put them beyond tolerance and mere civility.
Yeah.
But I think thinking through the concept, using the concept, helps us to identify that kind of thin threshold or thin set of duties that we can owe one another in order to coexist peacefully with them in a society without having to like or support everything they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, you made me think of a lot of things in that statement, with so many thoughts going through my head. One of them being around the government's role, from what I kind of think about as I'm listening to you, was in an ideal sense is maybe prioritizing how to say the protection of that individuality, in a sense, like protecting the ability for the Quakers to exist, protecting the ability for those people to exist without one dominating the other, I would say. And then the other part of that maybe is being prioritizing exit, right? So like if the government's role essentially is like, hey, if we're going to allow for this amount of diversity, or hey, in Texas you're going to make abortion illegal, well, like we need to make it really, really easy then for somebody who does not believe in that to go to a different place. And like that should be part of like the federal mandate, in a sense. Is that kind of how you would look at that from the government?
I really would, and I think that in a lot of ways our Constitution was designed to do just that. You don't have internal tariffs in this country for a reason. It was really recognized early on that would break everything. So the U.S. is a free trade zone. You can bring your goods to another state. Now, states can make rules about physically what you can sell, but they can't say you can only sell this when it's from Oklahoma. If it comes in from outside, you can't.
There is like fruit and pest laws, though. Sometimes I traveled from like Oregon to California, and they were like, we cannot take any of these fruits. You can't do this. There's like little kind of loopholes around that, I guess.
And that's always, with big globalization, that's a big tension. You go to New Zealand and you go through all sorts of checks and safety and everything. But getting back to that, kind of the role of the state, ideally, and thinking about where government power stems from, what gives the state the right or the authority to jail a criminal, or determine a property dispute, anything like that. Liberals perhaps tend to think of the state arising out of, as a steward of, our own rights of self-help. So presumably, if I'm assaulted, I can legitimately defend myself. I have a right to my life. Someone's attempting to take that from me. I can defend myself, even up to the point of doing harm or inflicting death upon my attacker. However, if everyone's just going around asserting a right of self-help to self-defense when they feel assaulted, this is really messy. It's hard to determine whose claims are legitimate, perhaps, and whose aren't. And it's really just inefficient. I have to spend all of my time watching my back, ready to spring to my own self-defense, rather than doing something else, tinkering with my phone, whatever, building a fire. And so if I have this right in a state of nature, naturally occurring, then it's legitimate for me to pass the enforcement duty on to this representative, the state. But if it's not something that I can do myself, in my mind, perhaps, say, enforcing copyright, if I come up with an idea or a patent, say, that doesn't seem like a naturally occurring right. It would be really hard for me to police other people's minds all over the world. Someone even, on the other side of the bay comes up with the same invention and starts making it. Hard for me to do much about that in the absence of a state and rules. But as a result, it's hard to see that as a legitimate use of government power. For all, in all but like the most utilitarian sense, because it doesn't seem like they're enforcing a right that I naturally have. They're doing something different. So I think that can often be a guide. It doesn't fit modern states very well because they've grown so far outside the bounds of what we might, naturally offer up to them. I have no right to go and make war on people around the world, and yet states have kind of developed that function and capacity and hold on to it dearly. But when we think about what's required for mere civility, we can think of the sorts of things that a state might be able to do on our behalf, but not the things that spring from nothing.
Going back to the civility aspect, there's a concept that I'm sure you're familiar with, like the paradox of tolerance, right? Like the one thing like a
Karl
tolerant community.
Popper, yeah.
Yeah, which you, if I remember correctly, you went to the school of Karl Popper, with London economics.
Yeah, Karl Popper was at LSE. It's only later that I found out that then he went to New Zealand.
Oh, interesting.
And he actually published, what is it, Open Society and Its Enemies? The Open Society? Anyway, from New Zealand. But yes, I'm familiar with the paradox of tolerance there. I think it's often waved around like a bloody shirt these days, frankly. Often it's invoked well before whatever intolerant minority we've identified as an issue, whatever, seems to threaten the state or the democratic polity. Like it usually seems to be trotted out when some minority is just being really nasty, but not in a way that seems like they're likely to seize power or something. And I think it's difficult because we can certainly see why something like that is developed in the wake of the Second World War. But if you look at contemporary German politics, the idea that the AfD is so dangerous or so outside the norm that the other parties can get together and ban it when it starts to become popular seems just abjectly undemocratic. And so there's always going to be some tension between the idea of extra democratic safeguards and respecting the will of the people, treating it as a feedback loop to be listened to, that I think is irreducible. You see it in the same way, perhaps, around the constitutional protection of fundamental rights. Now, I think that those restrictions on democratic output are much more legitimate because they're stable and long-standing, and they tend to be checks on majority action rather than something that seemingly can happen to a minority that gets a little bit too big or a little bit too worrying to the wrong people at some point in the future. There's a stability to the side constraints of the First Amendment or the Fourth Amendment that the more open-ended protections of democracy in the modern German constitution, just don't seem of the same type.
Interesting. I guess circling back to like your early jump into libertarianism as a career, I guess, if you will, and you're on the steps of the Capitol Hill stuff, and you're going to school to study theatrical props. Like, what did you decide, I guess, at that point in your life where, like, what did you end up pivoting to? Did you end up pivoting to philosophy? Like, what were the steps that you started taking at that point?
Yeah, so thankfully I was going to a college, Sarah Lawrence College, where you could pick your own classes a la carte. There weren't set majors, so you'd interview for each course, and you and the professor would decide whether you sort of made it in. But definitely tacked towards philosophy, law, and economics. At that point, I think my goal, the dream, was to eventually go to law school and work for an organization called the Institute for Justice, which sues the federal government when people's rights are violated. Very, what's that Japanese courtroom game? Like something out of a film. You go in, you lay down your brief, you fight the injustice. Ultimately, I found a niche, happened into a niche, in which I'm a kind of legal expert without having to go to law school, although I will never practice in a courtroom. I've just developed very deep knowledge of a couple key areas of internet intermediary liability law. But setting out into my policy career, I wasn't expecting to be doing internet policy per se. I was very interested in speech, and so reading about the First Amendment, traditional English speech debates that inform the creation of the First Amendment. You start reading a lot of case law, often things that just stick out to you as incongruous, interesting. Read people's law review articles. So that was all the beginning of sort of building that specialty. But a lot of it was, as well, transitioning from this sort of activist milieu to a much more professional setting, with a different set of norms and expectations around behavior. Certainly a little less chaotic. But that was a shift there, and even in it, you are viewed a little differently, perhaps, by your old activist pals. There's always anxiety about beltway libertarians. You're a libertarian, but you've gone to D.C. and you've been corrupted by it, and you've made these accommodations with state power. You'll say, well, that's just the way things are, and you have to look for the marginal improvement. This is the policy on the table, but if you're a purist living in your compound out in the sticks, that's not great. It almost looks like your specialized, professionalized representatives aren't pulling their weight. So that tension is everywhere.
Can you share more about your college experience? I'm really curious about that because you're the second person I've heard have a similar major, and actually you and I almost have a little bit of a similarity in that, like, I ended up customizing my own major at my college, although it wasn't a regular thing. How did being able to choose and almost like negotiate your way into whatever classes you wanted to or interview for them, like, how did that change and shape your learning and approach to, your own self-education, I guess?
I think it was very valuable to be able to come up with your own definition for what you're doing. To pull in, say, a kinetic sculpture with Arduino course, but use it to build a drone. because in your international relations class, you're beginning to think about, this is back in 2013, about how these quadcopters might be used in conflict, and so you want to see how hard it is to just build one from scratch yourself. Most other programs or set programs wouldn't be drawing a connection between those two things, or they'd have to be really specialized in that. But there it was something I could happen into. I could make the connection in the foreign policy class and then kind of test my hypothesis in this other microelectronics course. I think the other part of it is it just made the scholastic aspect of my college experience all the more valuable. Centered it within my college experience in a way that for those who had their set major, it was something they showed up to do but didn't think as much about its construction. The academic part of college seemed a little more siloed from the rest. Now, I will say that might also be a bit because as time went on, I felt that the Sarah Lawrence campus environment was probably, to go to your paradox of tolerance, too tolerant of aberrant behavior by some of its community members. People particularly suffering from mental health issues were sort of allowed to act that out, to live their truth a little bit too much in ways that impacted the level of community, campus life for others around them. And so I think in turning away from some of that, was able to, went deeper into the academic side of things. But I certainly find, different aspects of my college experience, I can't think of a course that I haven't used or applied in some way, and I think that is a product of being able to pick them. Just earlier today I was talking about referencing a book from an espionage in the 20th century course, which I took.
No, I resonate with that a lot, and I might go in a little bit of a diatribe here just to give you some context, but somebody asked me recently, what I majored in. I was like, I was a philosophy and theology major. I created my own thing. I was like, oh, you've never really used that in your life, and I was like, no, I use that every day. I use that every day because it has given me the tool set and skill set and knowledge and insight and questioning ability to craft my own world as I went through it. It's made me lots of money in various ways, and it's why I'm here now, approaching life the way that I do now, to have this podcast with you and all these different little pieces. And it's something that really, I feel like it really awoke in me. You'd actually love this episode too with Peter Miller. He's a shopkeeper out here in Seattle for 45 years. He wrote a book called Shopkeeping, which I also think you'd love. And he talked about how his one request of sort of our generation, and he's I believe he's in his late 70s or early 80s, and he was talking about how his desire for us is to make education be the most important thing again within the United States, if you will. And it struck me because I hear so many people, even in our generation, that looked at college as a way to get a degree, to have a better job, to then make more money.
Skill building.
Yeah, I don't even think it's skill building a lot of times. A lot of times it was get the degree. It was
about
credential
right. Getting.
It was about the paper, right? And I feel so it breaks my heart because I'm like, man, I think about your approach to school or my approach to school, or certain people who went to school and they talk, even Hope, who, again, she had an amazing, fascinating experience where they had a clothing optional dorm and everything was consensus based on how they did everything. It was very, very fascinating.
We ended up with a cult.
There you go. Right? And so there are all these different, because of the way that you engage with your education, it ends up changing your life in such a profound way. But, the way that I don't know if it's the system and how it's set up, if it's just a cultural thing or whatever it is, but like, are the focus on education for the sake of education, for learning, for actual like insight and growth and all of that for your own self-fulfillment seems so forgotten.
Well, if you're chasing a credential, education becomes something you do and then something you have done. You got the certificate, it's over. I've certainly selected into a job where continuing education is part of it. I always have to be learning about new laws, They arrest Telegram's founder, Pavel Durov, in France. Grabbed him off a plane the other day. They're citing these French laws about import requirements for encryption technologies. I suddenly have to learn about that in order to be able to speak intelligently on it. And so my work and really sort of broader self-conception requires continuous education. If I'm not learning new things, I'm falling behind because new things are happening. And I think too frequently we think of college, and perhaps even because of the time at which it occurs in our life. It's doing so many different things for us at once. It's this skill building, it's the credential, it's when we're supposed to unlock a lifetime love of learning, perhaps, and it's also our society's coming of age ritual.
Yeah.
You go to the kegger party, you join a frat, you become a man. My school didn't have fraternities, and maybe that explains a lot. But in mixing all of those functions together, I think it becomes very difficult for the collegiate experience to either do any of them very well or clearly distinguish what's going on at any given time. Now, obviously, to an extent, students are free to do what they want at college, and you certainly see people who have, regardless of what program they were in, school they ended up at initially, opted into a lifetime of learning, gathering as many credentials as they can. I mean, I always chuckle when I hear the people who will tell me that they have one major and 3-4 minors. I'm like, great, you managed to stack up the right number of credits in the right silos to get this paper, but I have one degree in the liberal arts, and that's it on paper. So even though we could certainly design education better to foster a lot of these functions, students aren't totally powerless, and we definitely see them choosing to get what they value most out of their college experience, or what their current self values most, we might say. But I think we can certainly be better, as a society, although I kind of hate that phrase, in thinking of college as the beginning of a lifetime of learning, or simply education is something that always exists, ought to exist outside of that schooling. Going back to my love of the Victorians again, they had a wonderful culture of sort of hobbyist, often workmen's organizations. These weren't elites, high status people, but who got together to illustrate birds or watch locomotives or whatever it might be, but had a much stronger sort of formal club culture than we do today, that I think encouraged people to think of themselves as lifelong learners, because it tied that lifelong learning to community and some level of social status. You could be, a boilerman, but have relatively high status within the Kent Ornithological Society because you put in the time there. If we don't have ways of respecting that, I think it's harder for people to see value in gathering that knowledge. It's something I think to be very aware of as well when we think of the impermanence of the internet. On one hand, we'll say, if you take a picture of it and put it online, it's there for forever. And yet constantly I find snippets of knowledge on some old news board, forum or something that disappear because it wasn't archived, the old server went down, somebody died and stopped maintaining things,
Right.
and that knowledge can be lost. It's part of why I really like YouTube, of all of the sort of social media, because it acts as such a valuable repository of knowledge, and it isn't nearly as presentist as almost any other platform I can think of, which try to give you a feed first and foremost of what's happening now.
Right.
And YouTube certainly gives you recommendations, but it's always that search box, or
Yeah.
right up top, front and center, inviting you to look for the video you need to find.
Yeah. Or even just getting recommendations that are 5 years old or 10 years old, right? It's like as you're on there, like the algorithm is done in such a way that you aren't always getting a recommendation for what's happening now.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Library of Alexandria.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm always struck. I did surgery on a snake the other week off of YouTube. Like, I found it on the street. It had been hit by a car. It had a prolapse, like, so it was split, and some of its intestines and stuff were coming out. And I watched vets fix this on YouTube several times. Laid out my, clean sheet, gloves, got some gauze, whatever, and I patched up this snake. And without YouTube, I would have been at a loss. I would not have had the confidence to attempt that. And, mechanically, it wasn't like the most difficult thing in the world. You're like poking some tissue back in and wrapping it
Yeah.
up. But the ability to watch someone do that, not just reading about it, but view them, made all the difference for that snake.
Yeah, no, I agree. Even with small little cooking things all the time, like the amount of information that I have, where I'm like, oh, great! It's the best way to actually peel a piece of ginger is with a small spoon. Never would have thought of that in a million years. Or if I had tried to read it from a book, to your point, I would have been trying to understand what the words are to understand this versus just watch somebody, which is a lot more efficient.
Efficient, perhaps, but I think also agentic. You're deciding what you need to pick up from that cooking video. Whether it's the way she cracks the egg or the way he whisks this, you're deciding what you need to incorporate into your cooking in a way that a lot of that information presented in the video, the chef's style, mannerisms, mode of doing little things, would be lost if they were writing about it, because they would either take it for granted or be making very specific choices about what to show. And obviously, directors do this with camera angles to an extent, but it's not nearly the filter that picking which words go on the page is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was going to ask you. Oh, that was what it was. So if you were going to teach a class about whatever you wanted and had your own little lobby of interested pupils on board, what would the class that you would teach be?
That's an interesting one. It's so much easier for me to think about the things that I would like to learn. Rather than what do I consider both valuable in passing on and that I'm capable of. Although there's certainly something to the idea that we learn by teaching others, watch one, try one, teach one. This is interesting. My mind doesn't really go to politics there. Maybe 3D printing. I've gotten very into resin printing recently, and I think I'd enjoy that. Games, perhaps, other sort of hobbyist things. I mean, doing terrain, like teaching a course on making miniature hobby terrain. I think that would be fun. I think I'd really enjoy engaging with the students' creativity. You know, what are they trying to render in miniature?
Yeah.
So yeah, probably that. Making miniature terrain.
Yeah. I'm curious, why do you feel like those are the things that come up for you versus something philosophical or teaching libertarian or even teaching about the Victorians or these other, honestly, more intellectual topics? You went to a lot more physical doing types of things, which I think is fascinating.
I think, frankly, it's just what I feel as though I've been missing the most in my life, and what in the last year or two I've been most intentionally putting in the work to backfill, to make the time for, to invest in that skill building rather than just getting back in front of the computer, reading, writing, whatever. I think I sleep much better when I've worked with my hands on something throughout the day, when it hasn't just been sitting, engaging through a screen. And so I think probably because filling in those gaps, capabilities, has been where I feel like I'm lacking most, where I want to improve, then that's where I think of helping others. It's also what sort of communities I want. I'd like to have more friends who print little things, and I did this the other week.
Oh, wow. Very cool.
Wyvern here.
Yeah.
All resin. And so yeah, that'd be fun. Always enjoy teaching people to shoot. I think both in sort of seeing the sense of agency it gives them, but also feeling like I'm contributing to the culture of gun safety that I would like to see. And, you know, adding people to my hobbies.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I'm curious with the gun safety aspect and like teaching that, like what is it that you're seeing with you mentioned like the agency people find and the kind of safety that you want to create. Can you just share more about that?
So often people are just scared of guns because they go bang and they could hurt someone. And so seeing a student master that fear, recognize that this is a machine, a tool with certain defined capabilities. It's not just going to go off in your hands. The bullet's going to emerge from the barrel at a very particular trajectory. That kind of eureka and the sense of, you know, physical ownership over themselves and their surroundings that it can give is very inspiring to see. And then beyond that, just, you know, so much of, you know, gun accidents, so many gun deaths are accidents, and so many accidents happen because people aren't following very simple safety rules. Always treating a gun like it's loaded, never pointing it at something you aren't willing to destroy. And so the earlier that I can give a new shooter these sorts of mantras, I think the safer they'll be throughout their career as with shooting.
Very cool. Are guns something you've had in your life since a young age, or is that something you came into later?
Pretty much my whole life. My father was very into shotgun sports, kind of both sporting clays and driven bird shoots. I always remember in show and tell, getting some raised eyebrows from the teacher at a young age. One of my first, I think, encounters with cultural difference and the tensions around it. When I brought in some pheasant feathers and excitedly told the class about getting to pluck the pheasants that my father had shot that weekend. And, you know, I was presenting this as kind of an honor that I was given to get to do this. And the teacher was looking at me as though I might have been abused. And so, yeah, they've always been around, and I think I've always had a certain respect for them born of that. Paintballing as a teenager made me really uncomfortable the first time I did it. I just raising that gun at a human, my friend running around, felt uncomfortable. I would stop or sort of roll it down into a low ready before getting over that, appreciating that this is a game. It's like a super soaker or whatever. But my safety impulses were such that something felt off, especially initially, about that game.
Yeah. You mentioned the cultural differences with your teacher as you were going through there. I'm curious, were cultural differences in your experience of them at an early age, was that fairly common for you as you kind of went through high school? Was there a stark difference between Will and then the world around him?
I think to an extent. I mean, it's always hard to disentangle that from just teenage awkwardness, because it's often you and the world around you as a teenager. How many emo songs, what it's like to be me. But I was raised around a lot of waspy, even sort of Gilded Age culture that was very much on the way out even when I was encountering it. Cotillion classes at Radnor Hunt Club. It's not something most millennial kids did. So those sorts of experiences always kind of both gave me a sense of the past and removed me from the present. These days with firearms collecting, I think that window or link to the past is often what's most moving and interesting about it. The Lee Enfield 22 trainer, kind of big bore Lee Enfield that's sleeved down to a little 22, and it was made in 1912. And when I shoot it, I feel like I have the ghosts of the boys who learned to shoot with this physical, the same gun, and then went off and died in the trenches in the First World War. Because this would have been one of the guns that they learned to shoot in training on. And I feel very moved picking that up and firing it. Going through those motions more than 100 years later. There's a connection there that it's hard to get otherwise. I always love reenactments, that sort of stuff. Trying to get a little more into that.
I think that's something that I'm noticing about you, or have noticed, especially as you connect with your philosophical views, is you have a deep love and appreciation and understanding of history that is connected to everything else that you do, or at least a lot of what you do. There's a lot of this sense of not philosophy for philosophy's sake, if you will, or even from a theoretical perspective, but a lot of your belief systems seem to be very grounded in history. There's an understanding of why this happened, or the practical implications of what has happened that have led to these kind of beliefs and stuff. Is that, you mentioned being kind of raised in a lot of the Revolutionary, war areas and that kind of culture. I guess I'm curious where or why that has come from for you, because it seems really important. It's something that I really, really appreciate about how you think about things.
I think that certainly matters, the kind of place of my upbringing, what I was exposed to there. I'm always struck by the quote, I can't remember who it's from at the moment, but that the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Because it illustrates the cultural difference you get in the past. And we can look around at different contemporary ways of doing things, different cultures in our current milieu, But I think one of the best ways to appreciate both how things can be different and how societies and norms can change and evolve is to look back to the past, to see how strange and foreign it all seems. I love diarists for this reason, because you get not just the difference in events, norms as understood by historians, their wedding practice was this or that, but their beliefs about them, what they felt good and bad about in their daily lives. I love Samuel Pepys for this reason, if you're familiar with him, an English diarist who lived through Restoration-era England, came back on the boat with Charles II, kind of a Forrest Gump of Restoration England, was not all that important himself, but was always around the movers and shakers. He was master of ships for a bit, but is also recording his embarrassment at breaking a toy of his wife's after they'd had an argument, saying, I feel bad about it, but I broke it when she wasn't looking because I was so cross with her. Or, God forbid, masturbating in the back of church. And he recounts these things, or missing the coronation after climbing up into the rafters to watch because he had to go take a piss. And, we can all appreciate that as moderns missing some important happening that we've waited a while for and stood in line because nature called at the wrong moment. Yeah. And so history gives you both that capacity for difference and the extent to which people in the past, in their foibles, failures, travails, were so much like us. And I take great comfort in that, frankly. Yeah. Being able to read the internal struggles of the great men of history. Winston Churchill was fighting off the Nazis, but as he was fighting that black dog of depression every morning. Yeah. And, it's too easy to I think, both mythologize, kind of turn these people into supermen, and to damn them on account of one or two decisions they made, or the times they lived in, and just the decisions they're sort of expected to make, or weren't even seen as morally important decisions in the moment. But it's awe-inspiring and horrifying to see how much they can be just like us. Even in their different cultural context.
Yeah, it strikes me too with your particular role, as a libertarian, but also kind of looking at policy or free speech or these other issues, that the importance, I think, for you in being connected to, what has happened in the past, how have these things evolved to become what they are now, right? Not just in the last decade, but to your point with the telegram, interesting. These things, there is some precedence for sort of an online communication or a text-based communication that existed before. What did this look like before? How did they handle it? How did they solve their problems initially? When did maybe government come into a way that was not helpful? How can we remedy these things in our current time? And all of that is seen as this natural flowing evolution versus just we have this thing now that we need to stop and adjust or change.
And what's contingent? Where those points are in the past where we really could have made a different decision that would have led to a very different present. Say if Richard Nixon had continued to be president and continued his planned nuclear build-out, we'd be a largely atomic-powered nation today. We wouldn't have the kind of climate politics that we have today because we would have cut emissions far earlier. Without history, you can't recognize that path not traveled. You aren't aware of it, or that you could have traveled it. Yeah. And so I think it's a large part of why I'm always so struck, obsessed by the First World War, because it feels like a moment when all of old Europe committed suicide, kind of sleptwalked, as one book refers to it, into this just civilization-destroying disaster.
Yeah. What are some of those key moments for you when you look back at history that like really stand out to you as like those pivotal moments in time where had a different direction been taken, we would be in a different place, either for better or worse in your experience?
I mean, certainly that beginning of the First World War, and I certainly think that was for the worse. Even the process of decolonization, I think, could have been done much better. A more considered handover of power and whole institutions.
When you say decolonization, do you mean like within the states, or like where?
Oh no, I mean like Africa.
Okay.
Had it not been a kind of a transfer forced by Europe's anemia after 2 world wars. Just a total lack of capacity to kind of throw up your hands and walk away from the Mau Mau, where we saw liberation replaced by strongmen over and over in a way that was fairly predictable given the sort of power vacuum that was left, and was really irresponsible of the colonizing powers. But again, at that point, they just bled themselves dry in Flanders Field, and again, a generation later, Kursk and Normandy. So that's always feels very pivotal. In American history, we have these very distinct ratchets that I think we can understand how we moved from one to the other, how we ended up with the level of state or government that we have now, but which can't easily be reversed. You look at the original sin of slavery and the Civil War, and there's no way you don't come out of that as a more centralized government. I mean, you've had a war about whether states can decide to leave or not, and the answer is no. So there's a very different relationship between perhaps these United States that we had before and this United States that we ended up with afterwards. Now, it was probably necessary. I don't think planter culture could have been bought off. It's not like the UK where it was just sort of a financial thing. It was a whole replication of like feudal cavalier relations done with blacks instead of English serfs 200, 300 years later by the folks who lost the English Civil War and come over here to replicate that kind of lifestyle. But nevertheless, it changes the charter of this country. Going to fight in the First and Second World Wars had a similar effect. You centralize a lot of things. In order to produce at scale for war, you need planning boards, price controls. But once you have that experience, you don't forget that power, you don't forget that ability to manage. I mean, Britain did it much worse than we in planning for peace. They still had currency controls through the 70s. When you went on vacation in France, you could only bring so many pounds with you to spend. So I think it makes me much more hesitant today to cross those kinds of Rubicons. I think I'm much more likely to be looking for them. I get rather nervous at the state of conversation in Washington about conflict with China, because far too many people seem to speak of it as a foregone conclusion, and I think don't appreciate how it would reshape the world, how the seas would be poisoned by such a conflict. Very little thought given to those sorts of things, but once you start sinking all of the gross haul tonnage that currently feeds China, that has an effect on maritime life. So Those moments are important. I mean, we can go way back. Jesus Christ, Christianity has done so much to create the Western conception of the individual by creating an individual relationship between you and God that then becomes political later on because your community is asking you to worship in a way that you think compromises that relationship with God, and so you say, no, I have an individual right, perhaps, to worship God as I see fit. Yeah, a lot of those junction points, it gets harder to identify them the further you go back.
Sure.
There's so much else that could have been, so much contingent on it, but always fascinated by them.
Part of what I understand that you do with your think tank and them is you focus a lot on the concept of free speech within the internet. And I know it's been a big conversation that has been happening, maybe not always in a focus standpoint all the time, but a lot of times it's happening, across Twitter or Instagram or all of these different platforms that, for one way or another, they censor speech. And some less so than others, and they're private institutions, but at the same time they're these kind of global entities in a lot of ways that have their own weird governance and sense of power and all of these different things. Like how do you think we need to think about free speech on the internet with these different platforms as currently constructed?
I'm very much of a let a thousand flowers bloom perspective on this. To the extent that we have options, that we have exit, then even the policies of very big platforms don't matter that much. I think where this becomes most difficult is where you have choke points through which speech must flow, or, for that matter, the money required to pay speakers, because it's one thing to do a podcast for free, but at the end of the day, you have to feed yourself, and if your supporters can't pay you for your time, it's very hard to continue to produce content for them. So I think I'm often most worried, really, about money transfer and the banking side of this, where it feels as though, compared to the social media space where you can post on YouTube or Vimeo or tweet or go to Facebook, if you need to send an international payment, it needs to go through one of a few very heavily regulated international transfers. And it's made less mainstream platforms, I've written about OnlyFans in this context, more limited in what they can do, how they can scale, what they can offer. And so I'd like to see more technically decentralized solutions to what are now choke points for speech, whether that's DNS registration, web hosting, areas in which you see what we might call deep deplatforming, where a website or a whole platform is bounced because its rules are seen as too liberal, perhaps, usually because it's been misused by bad actors against the wishes of the platform creators. And wherever possible, the best solution is to situate responsibility for misuse, for misbehavior of any tool, whether it's an internet-born app or a hammer, with the user, because they're the ones making the decisions about how to use the tool. Be AI image gen, can be used for all sorts of lovely creative purposes, can also be used to make nasty, fake, lewd images. We are making the call when we type in that prompt. We have intention about what we want to create, and ultimately we're all freer to create when it's our responsibility not to make a nasty image, rather than the responsibility of Adobe to make a tool that can't possibly be used to make a nasty image. You're always going to have false positives, and this new power, the new governors, as these platforms are referred to in quite a good paper about this issue by a woman named Kate Klonick. Their power might be very strong within their own walled garden, but for the most part, that's a temporary garden. We all used to use MySpace. There was a time when we were all on Big Blue Facebook. Now lots of people are on Instagram, elsewhere. So long as that platform can't build a regulatory moat around its activities, it seems as though in the due course of time they will become lazy about their advantage, the power of their network effect, and someone else will come along with something new and better, or just novel and interesting in a way that good old Facebook maybe isn't anymore. Things become staid. I think the capacity for social advancement is really important on social media. It's a lot of why we use it. So every new platform presents a kind of novel status game for people to play, and that's often the draw. It's not that mismanagement, perhaps, of social media platforms isn't without cost. I've certainly had issues with how Twitter's algorithm has changed recently and what it highlights. And something is lost when everyone can't gather in the same place. There's a serendipity, perhaps, that we might see on a default open space like Twitter, where someone can wander in and provide a valuable anecdote or piece of information that was missing from the conversation. But ultimately, I think we can have that kind of diversity of thought, that interplay between different speakers, within or between more technically decentralized networks. So I can both receive tweets or their equivalent from Blue Sky, Twitter, Nostr, the Fediverse, and more, but still choose to filter my feed, limit what I see to the sort of content that I enjoy, that moves me, and that can be more user-driven. It doesn't all need to be handed off to the platform. But traditionally we've bundled moderation and the social graph. When things are ad-funded, it kind of makes sense to bundle those things because you sell ads over your social graph and you need to moderate content so that your advertisers will feel safe there. They don't want to sell soap next to ISIS videos. But the more you can move away from that ad model, perhaps, and the more in which content moderation is seen as more of a pain in the ass for platforms than a real value add, then potentially the more we can separate those things. And I think that would be a useful step forward for the internet to the extent it can be done.
Very well said. I think we'll end with that, Will, so I really appreciate everything, your time. I think the final note or question that I would have for you would simply be, like, if you were going to leave the audience with a single question, what would that question be?
Everything feels trite. I don't know. I think going back to our conversation about historical junctures, I think the audience would probably enjoy or find it useful to think about which juncture they find most significant. What alternative future world that hasn't been catches their mind's eye, and why? What is it that's attractive about that space, that imagined reality? And is there a way in your own life that you can move towards realizing what you think the whole world might have lost?
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, yeah, no, that was great. That was awesome. Where can people follow you or find you if you want them to?
You can find me on Twitter at Will_Duffield. I've been there since 2008 when I signed up to receive the news via SMS on my flip phone, and what a long, strange trip it's been since. You can also find my writing at cato.org/Will Duffield. I think that will take you to the page for me, but you can Google me. I'm around.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. All right. I'll see you around.
Of course.